Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. Well, we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You could also become a supporter of the show by visiting thebittertruth.info. We've got pretty much everything there. The Patreon link is also there, but you can also visit patreon.com/thebittertruth. I can speak English today. That's, I guess, relative. But again, thebittertruth.info, you can access the show there in addition to YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all the other stuff. But if you want to make a one-time donation because you don't want to subscribe to Patreon, I get that too. I usually prefer that as well. So I understand. However, a couple of bucks a month helps the show out dramatically. We are going to talk about Cuba today for a little bit, and mostly because a couple of weeks back, the UN tried to vote to end the U.S. embargo and the many embargoes on Cuba, mostly the U.S. embargo, which is the most crippling to that country, even though they seem to have survived decently. And I've been to Cuba. I'll talk about that in a little bit. 184 countries voted to end the embargo. There's 207 sovereign nations, and 184 of them voted to end the embargo. I would call that a majority of the UN. Of course, the U.S. and Israel voted against it because, Israel is the U.S. lapdog, or the other way around. I don't know. Countries that abstained were countries like Colombia, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, Brazil, and Ukraine, which coincidentally had a neo-Nazi revolution in 2014 led by Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And they had weapons sold to them by Israel. No irony there. Let's have the Jews sell Nazis weapons. Good times. But let's get into it. I want to kind of jump into some of the history first, mainly because a show with this title, I don't know what the title's going to be yet, but a show with anything Cuba in it, you're going to have all the right-wing dipshits in Florida go on about human rights and blah, 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 because they're probably an expat because they probably lost stuff during the overthrow in 1959. And we will talk about why it's the U.S.'s fault that there was an overthrow in 1959. So these people that love to go on about Castro, coincidentally, they love to fail to make the point that it's the U.S. that was occupying Cuba for 60 years, putting in every knothead dictator, president, governor that we could, including a couple of American governors in the early part of the 1900s, to keep the people broke and poor, and the oligarchs who were running things to the detriment of the people. So what happens when in a situation like that we have seen time and time again is the people get kind of fed up and they end up throwing out the powers that be. So to my right-wing Marco Rubio types who were like, it's a human rights violation. Well, you're an idiot or you're just lying. I'm not going to even use nice words like disingenuous. You're just a fucking liar. If you know the history of Cuba at all, and you're going to tell me that it's all Castro's fault, you might want to blame the U.S. because our foreign policy is just a craptastic shit show. So let's not go too far back, but let's just go to the Spanish-American War, right? So the USS Maine explosion, which was blamed on Cuban missiles blowing up the ship in Havana, got us into the Spanish-American War, and then that got us to take over Cuba after 500 years of Spanish rule. So Spain had Cuba for 500 years. And this was the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire because we took over pretty much the rest of what they had left. In addition to that, we took Guam and Puerto Rico. We paid $20 million for the Philippines at the time. And, I'm not going to go too much into this part, but then we were stuck in the Philippines for about 13 years fighting the Filipinos who did not want to give over the country to the United States just because they paid $20 million to their former occupiers. So, there's that. If you don't notice the pattern with a lot of this shit, it's a lot of white people determining what black and brown people will do. And when they don't do it, the white people get real mad and do really fucked up shit. Because the last time I've seen the Philippines, try to pull a coup in California was never. So anyway, I know that's a simple example, but walk with me. So after 60 years of puppet governments, including a couple of, American provisional governors, the Cuban Revolution happened, and three-time president, Fulgencio Batista, who was installed by us 3 times. I'll give you an example when I say installed. They were, quote, elections. But as you know, watching some recent elections, that they're not all kosher. And especially when the U.S. wants somebody in there, like Barack Obama wanted his guy in there in Honduras in his last year in office, the number 3 guy who had the 3rd most votes in the election in Honduras suddenly became president. Isn't that funny? But that's how we work. So anyway, he was kicked out when the country fell apart and the Cuban Revolution took over and the Castro brothers took over and all of their lot. And I'm not going to sit there and say that the Cuban Revolution was perfect. I'm not going to even say it was particularly fair or just. Rum companies and all that had to split and go to Mexico or whatever, or Puerto Rico, because they were being overrun. I've been to Cuba. I've been to a lot of former plantations that used to belong to somebody and now belongs to the government. We could argue whether or not that was fair. Most of those plantations and companies, worked on near slave labor anyway. So, like I said, it's not a simple matter in terms of right, wrong, and black and white. But neither is America, if you want to go there, because we're definitely not. We definitely don't corner the market on right and wrong. But yeah, Bautista was our guy, and as were all the Cuban leaders for 60 years. And we had the Cuban people just basically work for pennies, and we got all their sugar and all their cigars and all their stuff. And then it was basically the Vegas of the Atlantic. It was pre-Bahamas, right? We had casinos there, and the mob was down there, and people had houses down there. Ricky Ricardo, Desi Arnaz had a house down there, and Hemingway had a house down there. All gone when the revolution happened. And when it's argued that it's one of the last reasons that Hemingway had to blow his head off in 1961, because he loved Cuba, and he couldn't really go back there for a while because we started this embargo crap, and he couldn't travel there. So anyway, I say all that to say this, because this is the challenge with this narrative. Again, when you hear about Cuba, you hear about these human rights violations, you hear about how bad it is. And I've been there, and it's not bad. Is it rich? No. Is it because we sanction their ass? Absolutely. It's one of the cleanest countries I've ever been to. The people are lovely. I was there about 10, 11 days, did 5 cities, and saw no homeless people, by the way. They have a UBI. They got free medical. I stuck my head into some of the hospitals because my brother's a doctor, and I wanted to try to take some pictures, but they didn't let me. But I can say from eyewitness, just watching, and it's as good as any American hospital. And I might repeat this fact a couple of times today, but the number 1 export of Cuba are teachers and doctors. They produce more teachers and doctors per capita than anywhere in the world, whereas we produce more bombs. So yay us. And COVID deaths. We're number 1 in bombs and number 1 in COVID deaths. So that's awesome. But we're still butthurt because we, quote, lost, and we don't like the big red dog, or in our backyard, as it were. So we still insist on the sanctions and the embargoes. And despite this, Cuba still works. Like I said, I'd been there. One of the cleanest countries I'd ever been to. Havana is kind of a living ruin, just because it's, nobody owns anything there. So the upkeep outside is very minimal. It's bare. But you go inside any of these people's homes, which we did because I stayed in, rooms that we rented. It was insane. I mean, they're clean. They're lovely. So all this stuff that you hear about how bad it is, we make it tough on them. But they're still able to get scotch and whiskeys and all of that. But they have full medical. They have full free education. They have a UBI. And in fact, I met more English speakers in Cuba than I had in any other Latin American country that I had ever visited. So, for example, if I did run into people, not if, but when, ran into people who spoke English, they insisted on speaking English to practice their English. And almost all of them went to the University of Havana. And their English was flawless. And I mean, they knew how to speak English. And most of them that I had met had not ever left Cuba. So there's something to be said for their educational system, and an educational system that I guess teaches people how to think versus what to think. Like we do here, we've taken our colleges and turned them into vocational schools. I had a lot of philosophical discussions running into people in Cuba, in the bars and places we stayed, people's homes where we stayed. And, but anyway, they're still dealing with countries like the Netherlands and China and Japan and Russia and Italy. So they still trade with Cuba. So Cuba still has, some sort of income coming in. But the damnable misery of all of this is you've got a country that's 90 miles away, the United States, and people who would love to go to Cuba. And they have some of the most beautiful resorts I've ever seen that are probably at 20% capacity. For example, most of the countries that I just rattled off, it's a haul to get to Cuba when you can go, when you live in Japan, say, for example, you have beaches there, or Mexico or whatever, you're probably not going to want to just go to Cuba. But they are still able to trade, and they're able to still generate a GDP. But even cigars, we sit there and say, how we can't buy Cuban cigars, man. I brought a fuck ton of Cuban cigars home when I went on that trip. But even the cigars are still Cuban owned. If you buy Cohibas or Romeo and Juliet, they're made in the Dominican, but the Cuban government owns those cigar factories. They own those plants. They own those plantations. They own the tobacco there. It just comes from the Dominican, and it's incorporated there, but it's still the Cuban government, and it's still Cuban income, which is completely hypocritical, because we keep going on about Cuba. And to my little right-wing friends who like to go on about Cuba like fucking idiots, need I remind you that the United States supports 73% of the world's dictators, including Saudi Arabia, which is nothing but a dictatorship, who's blowing up Yemen still. And, Colombia, for instance, where in the last 10 days, we have sent U.S. troops and the British have sent troops to save Colombia. I'll get into some of their sins here in a minute. But Colombia is a full-on fucking dictatorship. So even though they have, quote, elections, whatever, it's the same right-wing crap that I'm going to get into here in a second that we do all over the world. We don't like socialist governments in our backyard, because then Americans see that, hey, oh, wow, we can have healthcare. Oh, wow. And if anything you learn from the pandemic, it's that you've been lied to. Apparently you can work from home. Apparently there is money, right? Just not for you, but there is money. And apparently you can work from home. And apparently if we wanted to, say, for example, get some medical program rolled out like we did with the vaccines, it's not that expensive, and it's not that much of a problem when we want to do it. And again, when I say we, I mean the taxpayer. I don't want to get too far down this hole, but when I hear people say, oh, you want the handout from the government? No, dude, it's my fucking money. I want more bang for my taxpayer buck. And I don't know what the Cubans pay in taxes. I know they do pay some taxes, but they also get a UBI. Saw no homeless people there. Not one. They have state mental hospitals to take care of the real problems, the people they have, that can't function. That's some of the homeless people. But because they got a UBI, at bare minimum, you're getting some cash coming in. Then of course, those with jobs, those that run a business, like doing a version of Airbnb, like we stayed in Cuba. There was a version of Uber when we were in Cuba. Guys were licensed by the government so that they can't roll people and rob them. So it was like a pre-Uber, right? And a ton of guys. I mean, the cars weren't that great, but who cares? You just want to get from point A to point B. But we didn't get robbed. We're open carry with booze. We're walking down the street with beers and cigars, and people are just sitting on their porch, hey, waving at you. They can tell you're American, and even the way I speak Spanish like a guy from LA. So it's a great country. It's a great country. And if we would just let them thrive and do their thing and quit thinking we have to run their fucking government. That's the problem with this country is, we're doing it with Syria right now. Well, they had that election and Assad. I'm like, I'm not going to sit there and preach the virtues of Bashar al-Assad, but don't sit there and tell me that he's a chemical gas murderer guy when all of that was debunked and we still want to overthrow him. And there's interest to do so. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Qatar, they want to run a pipeline through Syria into Turkey, into Europe. That's been this whole mess for 10 years. They've been trying to overthrow Syria to get their way. And instead of just admitting that, they go on with human rights violations. Meanwhile, we drop more bombs on them than Assad has ever thought about killing on his own, supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, groups that we pay for, that we support. And, any of your friends that want to talk about Syria in a brass tacks way, and if you want to just end the argument right there, ask them this question. Well, wait a minute. If Assad is fighting al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we're fighting those guys, theoretically, Well, then why aren't we backing Assad? See, because when it's bullshit, it's bullshit. Bullshit is a double-edged sword. If you want to bullshit, that's great, but you're going to get caught by your own bullshit. Okay. So where was I in the middle of my pithy rant? Oh yeah, hang on. Let me turn the pages of my notes. Yes, believe it or not, I have notes. This may sound like an insane man who's just ranting, but it's not. It's actually very, very scripted. I have bullet points. So why the hate? We do have as I mentioned earlier, we have a history of freaking out with socialist countries. Venezuela, we keep talking about Maduro being a dictator. He's actually run for office against 2 or 3 other people. And the parties that didn't participate were parties that stood down by orders of us, the United States, to make it look like they were being suppressed. And they weren't being suppressed. In fact, what I love to compare, when people, socialist countries don't work, I go, well, Colombia is a capitalist country. It doesn't seem to be working. As I mentioned earlier, the US and Britain have troops down there, and there's riots down there because they're sick of his shit. And now they're trying to overthrow the government there. And let's just go down some of their greatest hits and tell me if this sounds like a capitalist country to you. Actually, it probably does sound like a capitalist country to you if you know the punchline. So they got a 50% poverty rate. The government there murders journalists and labor leaders. They murder peasant farmers, campesinos by the thousands. Anyone that's quote illegally growing cocaine, compared to the legal cocaine that the Colombian government sells to the CIA. If it's illegal cocaine that the campesinos sell to make some extra money because the people there live under austerity and make jack and shit in wages. So they're murdered by the thousands and their crops are burned. Coffee as well. Anyone that grows coffee illegally, meaning that the government doesn't get to sell it to the United States for a nickel a pound. Rigged elections. Doesn't that sound familiar? These are all the things they accuse Venezuela of. Venezuela does not have this kind of a poverty rate. In fact, they even with sanctions, their poverty rate's pushing 35%. Before more sanctions, because in Obama's second term, he laid more sanctions on Venezuela, they had like a 15% poverty rate. When Hugo Chavez took over, he nationalized the oil. He gave his people a living wage. He took that cash and built affordable housing that those people with the higher wage could afford to either buy or rent, paid for education, paid for medical, yet he was called a dictator. And, in typical American democracy fashion, we tried to kidnap him in 2002 out of his own country. And because something tricky about Venezuela, man, if you ever want to pull a coup, number one rule, you got to get the army. And for some reason, we just can't get the army. I don't know if it's because they're well paid or they're super loyal, but let's just say this is not the Iraqi army or the Afghan army. These guys don't lay down their weapons. They don't play ball for shit. So they got Chavez out of the American embassy and threatened to kill everybody if they didn't let him go. And so Chavez was released, but he was going to be treated Manuel Noriega style and taken out of his country and tried in an American court as a dictator for war crimes. I would love to see Russia come over and kidnap one of our guys, Biden or Trump or whoever, and take him to Moscow and try his ass and put him in a prison for war crimes. We have so many American leaders and former American leaders who cannot travel to many places internationally because there are warrants for their arrests. Like Spain has a warrant for Henry Kissinger's arrest. If he comes to Spain, he will be placed under arrest. Bush and Cheney have warrants in some European countries. They cannot go to certain European countries because they are war criminals. And they are war criminals. This isn't hyperbole. The definition of a war criminal is someone who commits war crimes in the aims of defeating another country, right? So bombing civilians knowingly, dropping white phosphorus and depleted uranium in Iraq, creating birth defects. Iraq is still suffering from birth defects from all the depleted uranium we've dropped. Israel drops white phosphorus on Gaza all the time. So to me, back to the point, Colombia and Venezuela, it sounds like Colombia is, in violation of a fuck ton of human rights violations, but they call themselves capitalists, which is translation is they give us their crap for free or near free. Because if they nationalized everything like they should, their people wouldn't be making, 4 cents a day, and having a lower quality of life than we do in the United States. Listen, before the pandemic, we had 50% of Americans making under 30 grand a year. A minimum wage in this country will not get you a 1-bedroom apartment on a full-time schedule in any county. None. So we're fast becoming Brazil, country with all these resources, richest country on earth, and half the working population are poor, working 2 or 3 jobs in some cases. But if you look at our history with this shit, Argentina, Salvador Allende, he didn't want to play ball with American copper. Same deal. So, CIA pulled a coup down there and installed General Augusto Pinochet, who was a mass murdering maniac dictator asshole who got to die at the ripe old age of 90, worth about $30 million. And let's backpedal a hot second, because Venezuela, we keep supporting that fucking twerp Juan Guaido, who lost in December. He lost his seat, his little, Congress seat in December. And most of his party were thrown out in the elections. So we keep backing a guy and calling him the interim president, stealing Venezuelan assets like Citgo and $2 billion worth of gold out of the Bank of England, and backing this idiot who is under investigation for stealing $90 million from the last 5 coups that Trump paid for, right? And Joe Biden just doubled down again. He doubled down on Guaido on the second day of his presidency, but just announced this week that he's going to continue to support Juan Guaido, the interim president of Venezuela, who is going to get $30 million to back yet another fucking coup. And who gave Biden the money? Trump and Nancy Pelosi. So if you're not figuring out by now that these people are not your fucking friends, it is one big corporate gangbang and you don't belong in it, you should be feeling that way. Nicaragua did it twice, right? And it's interesting now that Daniel Ortega has been running that country for quite a while now without interruption. They have a UBI. They got medical. They got free college. What I see at the border is interesting. So far, the countries that I see trying to get into this country are all countries that we have successfully fucked. Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, right? Nicaragua, there are no Nicaraguans at the border. Not a lot of Nicaraguans trying to get in here because they have like an economy, right? People are surviving. They're beyond surviving. They're thriving. Honduras, highest per capita murder rate in the world right now. Thank you, Obama and Hillary, because we arrested Manuel Zelaya in his pajamas in 2009 for the crime of raising the minimum wage. Guatemala, we got rid of our Benz and, same deal, coffee and bananas. The Dulles brothers did not like the fact that, they were nationalizing their produce. They're nationalizing their sugar. They're nationalizing their resources, paying their people. And, if you know anything about the Dulles brothers, Charles Foster Dulles, before he became Secretary of State, was running Chiquita Banana. Now, his brother, Alan Dulles, was running the CIA. So he goes to his brother, hey, I got a problem in Guatemala, and they took care of it. Pulled a coup. Nixon went down there when he was vice president and did the whole, we're here for democracy and doo-da. Venezuela, talked about that. Another quick side note on Venezuela. This was firsthand experience from my uncle, actually, who lived in Venezuela till he passed away. Him and my dad left the West Bank in the late 50s. And they were both in Brazil together for a hot minute. And then my uncle ended up in Venezuela, and he spent his entire life in Venezuela. He wasn't, he didn't own a summer home, but he did okay. He had a couple of dime stores and little grocery store. So, he never had a job. He always owned a business. So he's always able to stay above, the fray. But in the 80s, they were running more than a 50% poverty rate, where people were starving, like actually starving in the street. In the United States, you see that here with the homeless and the tent cities and everything, and everyone living under a bridge. My uncle used to say that it was worse than that. Because you go to your car and people, and like somebody would be lying next to your car, like starving to death. And so you'd go back inside, call an ambulance, whatever. And if they could come and get the guy in time, maybe they could save his life. And sometimes they didn't. This was Venezuela in the 80s. However, hey, they were a democracy at the time. They called themselves a democracy, which meant they gave us their oil for jack and shit. And we basically paid the too big dictator there. Like we paid, Pinochet. We gave him a Cadillac and $500,000 a year, and, made sure, ensured his safety, made sure his troops were cool. And that's what we do. Excuse me. I can get into Iran. Same thing with the Shah. If you want to listen to a show I did a while ago on a brief history of Iran from the end of World War I to the present day, if you heard that show, you'll know that there were two Shahs, who I like to call Shah 1 and Shah 2. Shah 2 is the guy that we all know as the Shah. And Shah 1 was his old man who committed the crime of nationalizing Iranian oil. And at that time, pissing off the British and the Russians in the 20s. And he was overthrown and his dickhead son was installed. I'm sure Thanksgiving was really awkward in that family. So I think bottom line is, we are just such assholes because we just don't want to see socialist governments succeed in our backyard. We don't want Americans asking questions. They've already asking questions this last pandemic. Well, why can't we have a UBI? I wasn't the only one that did this kind of math, but if we paid $2,000 a month to every working American over the age of 18, that's about $1.5 trillion a year. Our war budget is $1.2 trillion. And during the COVID crisis of last year, and this, still some would argue it's still going on, we gave Wall Street and the banks $1 trillion a day for over 6 months. That money is like never coming back. And it's not even reflected in our taxes. So when people tell me, oh, my taxes are going to go up if we have Medicare. Really? Let me tell you something. Our taxes don't reflect the wars for the last 20 years. Our taxes don't reflect the bank bailout in 2008. They don't reflect the current bailouts. Our taxes don't reflect a lot. We keep doing this fiat currency thing. So whether it's destructive or not, that's a whole nother show, because we can argue the fiat currency is not good. And which is why I think, Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies are coming up, because people are realizing that you need something that is finite to grow in value and not just print more of it. However, I think people are starting to realize that if that money is there to be printed, why not print it for the American people? Because trickle down doesn't work at all. It's been proven not to work. In fact, since Reagan brought up this shit in the 80s, American wages have stagnated. And if you know anything about the minimum wage, it hasn't gone up in 35 years. It went up to $7.10 in the late 80s, then $7.25 in 2009 when Bush signed, or 2008 when Bush signed it into the deal. And now for 13 years now, it's been $7.25. And we keep saying how production has gone up. Well, great. If we're going to make the minimum wage commensurate with production, then the minimum wage should be about $25. And for businesses that are small, like bars and things like that, why don't we take $300 billion out of the defense budget, and then we can go ahead and subsidize businesses, say under 100 employees. I'm just tossing a number out there, but just as a for example. Of course, you have to do some metrics and figure some shit out. But let's just say anybody under 100 employees, they can get a subsidy or a big tax break if they're paying $25 an hour, which they have to, because we would raise the minimum wage federally, not in one city or the other. The financial bros love to say that. Well, if you raise minimum, look what they did in Seattle. They raised minimum wage in Seattle, and $15. A lot of businesses just closed and left. Okay, yeah, but if you want to do business in the United States, you're paying the minimum wage. That's why the minimum wage is a federal minimum wage. Every state, Mississippi, Kentucky, Louisiana, California, all of it, right? So $1.2 trillion for the defense budget, $1.5 trillion for UBI, and that wouldn't be enough to buy a summer home or to, quit your job. But an extra $2,000 a month coming into your household would take the edge off. I go to bars. I talk to people. I actually talk to people. I don't just go to bars and just, drink and sit around like an asshole and watch the game. I talk to people, just chit chat. And it's amazing what they'll tell you with the slightest bit of provocation. And, it's like $2,000 a month coming in would at least cover rent, mortgage, some of a mortgage, depending on where you live, car note. And I mean this for, quote, rich people too. Everybody, every working American over 18 gets a $2,000 UBI. Like I said, not enough to buy a summer home. But when I saw the UBI in Cuba, again, people that just counted on the UBI didn't have as good a life as people that, say, for example, had a job and the UBI, or a business and the UBI. Those people did better, obviously. But that UBI was there. It was there to just kind of the basic opportunity afforded to everyone. Outcomes are not guaranteed, but you can guarantee an opportunity. That's what we used to do in this country. When union participation in this country was, 40% of the workforce were union jobs. Now it's not even 6%. Don't tell me that, capitalism was working and that, it's just crony capitalism. No, capitalism by design is to make more profit. It's to squeeze infinity out of finite resources. It's just not working. It has stopped working. And for any American that's listening to this right now, freaking out, beg your pardon here. Let me take a sip of my whiskey soda. It's yummy. And we're going to wrap up in a little bit. But anybody that's listening to me right now and they're freaking out, we're American, we're capitalists. No, we're not. It's not in the Constitution. Capitalism is a pretty new system. It's barely 400 years old. Adam Smith pretty much came up with it to get out of the feudal system, if you remember the serfs and all that crap. So it's not it's not immutable. Okay. So we can change systems and still be American and still go to baseball games and still dig rock music and still have barbecue, right? If we went to a socialist system, for example, he said it. Yeah, fucking A. You like the airport? Okay. The airport is run by the government, either the state or the city or the county. They rent spots to United and Southwest, which is why when I go home to LA at the end of July, I'm flying home for about $150 round trip. And I can do that because the government subsidizes the airlines. And they're not paying rent at the airport, because if they had to pay for the airport and pay for the lease on that property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, despite the monies they're taking in from all the restaurants and the concessions, they would still charge me $1,000 to go visit California. Period. And you know that, and I know that, because the function of capitalism is to pass the costs along to the consumer. There's not a single cost that they absorb, including their own taxes, that they don't pass on to the consumer. I'll give you a quick example and I'll start wrapping up. I have T-Mobile. So about a month ago, I was getting ready to get on a conference call, and all of a sudden it said, you're going to have a penny a minute to call this number. The conference call was in Minnesota or something. And I thought, well, that's stupid. Why a penny a minute? This isn't long distance. Am I calling the Canadian part of Minnesota? So I did it on my computer phone. And then instead, because I got pissed at paying, I pay enough money. Even though a penny a minute is nothing, it's just fuck you guys. So I called them. I was really nice about it. Hey, so since when is Minnesota a toll on my unlimited data plan? And they said, oh, well, we get charged that penny a minute, and we decided to finally just, make the customer pay for it. And I'm going, pay you guys quite a good chunk of change every month. You figure you guys could squeeze, 30 cents a month or $1 a month and pick up my little conference call cost, right? Nope. They pass that on to me along with all their taxes and all their happy horse shit. So kind of, the reason this whole thing got started, back to my Cuban American friends who are yammering on about, fucking justice. Again, you might want to blame the US for fucking your country for 60 years before the Castro brothers took over. 4th of July happened, and saw a lot of fucking memes about, yay, America. I love living here, and I love the culture, and I love a lot of the people. And I'm old enough to remember that we had way more freedoms than we do now. And for those of you who are too young to remember the kinds of freedoms I'm talking about, we used to have them. And now with the control of the internet by oligarchs and the ruling elite, we're seeing less and less of those freedoms. We're seeing more and more of our rights taken away the last 20 years, using 9/11 as the biggest excuse ever. I'm not going to minimize what happened on that day, because I remember that day, and it was pretty goddamn terrible. But it did not justify giving up our rights wholesale, because the idea of supposedly being in a free country is to not let an incident like that turn us into a bunch of pussies and give over our rights for the illusion of safety, which is what we've done. And now we're calling environmental guys extremists. We're calling pro-Palestinian guys extremists. We're calling BLM extremists, because it's not extreme to go want to bomb other countries and take their shit. It's not extreme to keep imposing Jim Crow laws on black and brown people in this country, 150 years after slavery was made illegal. And, and then 60 years after, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, which is interesting because that took 100 years after slavery ended. Right. I can go on, and I'm wrapping up, so I won't. But I saw, kind of back to my point, I saw a ton of memes from a lot of my immigrant friends that live here. Many of them too young to understand what we did to their country. All right. I got Iranian friends. I don't say Persian, because Persia's been gone a long time. To my Iranian friends who want to have their little American friends not be uncomfortable, fuck that and fuck them. Read a book. Okay. It's not Persia no more. It's not Babylon either. It's Iraq now. It used to be Babylon back in the day. It's now Iraq. Okay. So there's that. But I saw a lot of these memes, I'm so grateful to be allowed to come into this country as an immigrant. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. You are aware that we fucked your country, which caused your parents to pick up and split, which is why they left and came here. You do know that. That's kind of important. Same thing with my Cuban friends. Sorry you had to split. Sorry you had to jam out of Cuba. Sorry the circumstances weren't going to be favorable, or you thought so, or whatever. And you might have been right. I don't know. I mean, obviously, if you were wealthy in Cuba in 1958, you were no longer wealthy in 1960. So, you had to come here. If you got here, we allowed quite a few people to come here. And if you made it here, awesome. Good for you. But know who fucked your country. You want to blame the Castro brothers? Know who fucked your country. And it's not perfect, like I said, but Bautista wasn't doing what the current government does for its people. Bautista wasn't producing more teachers and doctors per capita. Bautista wasn't developing any vaccines anywhere. They didn't make a copy of the polio vaccine and send that out. Okay. Cuba has a COVID vaccine. They crushed COVID down there. Again, we don't want people to see that, because if socialism works, then we're going to want some. And what the American oligarchs are figuring out, what the bot government is figuring out, what the one-party system is figuring out, because if you think there's a Republican and a Democrat, you're out of your mind. There are no Republicans. There are no Democrats. It's one big money party. It's a big corporate clusterfuck, and you aren't in it. They just figured out that if you see it, you're going to want it. And how much longer we can keep doing this? The last election, I said it. I've been saying it for a long fucking time. If 30 million people had balls, instead of telling me the same shit you see from TV, if 30 million people had balls, instead of telling me that a third party can't work, if 30 million people had balls and voted for a green candidate or the socialist candidate or the libertarian guy or whoever, if 30 million people had balls to scare the fuck out of these guys, we'd see some real change. You might even see some changes in the Congress to actually push real bills through, not resolutions. Right? We're gonna have a resolution. We're gonna write a sternly worded letter to Joe Biden. It's not working, man. The system is not working, and it's not working for a vast majority of this country. If you have I'm not starving. I'm not complaining on that regard for myself, but I have empathy. And quite frankly, if I'm being transparent, if anybody that's listening to this show has ever been broke before, and you know what being broke is, then you can empathize with people that are constantly broke, not just having a bad month, but like a bad long time. And when you're working 2 or 3 jobs and you're still not making it, something happened. The median income in this country in 1969 was $9,400. You could buy a house for $25,000 because that was the average price of a house. And a car was about $1,500. So you could pay cash or finance a car, whatever. But a $9,400 income could buy a $1,500 car. A $9,400 income could buy a $25,000 house. I know people making $200,000 who cannot get a house because they still have student loans. It's insane. We live in crazy town. So it's time to change it and fix it. On that note, you guys, again, Cuba, more your friend than Nancy Pelosi. There's a bumper sticker for you. They're more your friend than Donald Trump. Again, guys, visit the show, visit the website, thebittertruth.info. Appreciate the support of the show. Feel free to like and share and do all that stuff. I rarely ask for that kind of thing, but I am crappy with this algorithm thing. And I'm sure that some of it has to do with the subject matter I cover. But regardless, man, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.